Helmut. I would like now to invite the special representative of the Secretary General, Mrs. Margareta Wahlström, to join the podium. Mrs. Wahlström is also not only SRSG, but also leading, as I explained in my previous remarks, the UN ISDR process, for which we are so thankful. Mrs. Wahlström will address towards a post-2015 framework for disaster risk reduction, and we have the opportunity and the pleasure to be informed from very first hand about the process which has been taken and which is in front of us. So please, Mrs. Wahlström, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.
Can I put this down a bit so I can see? Okay. So good afternoon, dear Walter, dear Mayor Kaviezel, for welcoming us again to Davos, to this traditional conference now. And dear colleagues of the disaster risk reduction community, professionals, UN colleagues, and many others. I think in the opening statements here, we've already heard quite a lot, not only about the bad state of play in the world, but also what we can do about it. So before I move to the future, which in this case I will talk mainly about the next 7 months, let's just think back. Many of you have been part of this process to get disaster risk reduction to this point for 30, 35 years. I see a bit of white hair in the audience here, so probably many of you remember the first effort by Andrew, the first United Nations resolution in 1971 or something that basically said, watch out, it will only get worse, we have to tackle the risks. We didn't do that very effectively for quite a long time. But after that, many of you have worked with the IDNDR. That was a strongly science-driven decade. The Yokohama strategy and plan of action for a safer world. Some of you will recognize this for a safer world name. It still exists with the community working on preparedness. And then the International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, ISDR, was established in 1999. And every time there has been a sense of we don't seem to be able to influence change. But I think we are beginning to influence change now, thanks to all this work that all of you are doing in your various areas of expertise. I want to take you back to another thing that happened 30 years ago. There was something called the World Commission on Environment and Development, which issued the report Our Common Future, which also sounds familiar. And the Commission pointed out that for the first time we can see the planet Earth from space, and they observed that humanity's inability to fit its activities into that pattern is changing planetary systems fundamentally. Many such changes, they went on to say, are accompanied by life-threatening hazards. This new reality from which there is no escape must be recognized and managed. That's 30 years ago. Now, what disasters happened in the 80s? Some of you will remember it was not a decade that was particularly lacking in hazards. We had a very serious El Niño episode. We had the big famine in Ethiopia and in Sudan. We had devastating earthquakes in Mexico and Salvador. We had the Chernobyl event. We had a huge earthquake in Armenia. And we had the Exxon Valdez oil spill. So all these things that we believe today are new are old. So what is it that is happening now that we believe will change this scenario? Let me share with you what I think has happened, at least in the past 10 years, an accumulation of things. and look back. What has the Yoga Framework for Action helped us to do? Sometimes I say if the world only had one single framework, they should use the Yoga Framework for Action. The people who designed this framework were so far-sighted, they tried to put everything into one framework about stability and sustainability. That vision we must keep, because this is a particularly, in many ways, a positive process. This is very absent, very far away from the political tensions that seem to dominate the discussions on climate, for sure, but I'm sure we will get also to some interesting discussions when it comes to the development framework and particularly the financing of it. So 10 years of work with the HFA has achieved a lot of things for countries, I think. But a couple of things I believe have really moved us forward. One is there has been a very rapidly changing understanding of a disaster, moving away from classic looking at disaster as an event. It happens, you pay for it, and you move on. Now I think, and this is critically important for the future, more and more people in daily life, they understand that disasters are not events, they are actually long processes, and they have also understood that we need to move from the event to understanding the risk. Then all this different use of risk, but this is a critical shift in our mindset. And the second thing that really is beginning to change the way we do business, both in the public and private sector, is a very rapidly evolving understanding of the financial and economic consequences of disasters. Very concrete and practical and very necessary. And with these two things, I believe we now have a very different conversation in most ways about the way forward. What has also happened in these past 10 years is that we've managed to build an architecture of collaboration around disaster risk reduction, from national platforms, supposedly intended to be inclusive, are not inclusive everywhere, but they will become inclusive eventually, to regional, stronger and stronger regional platforms, we call them. They are slightly different still because they have evolved in different regions with different setups, different intergovernmental structures, but they're becoming more and more similar and a very strong platform in that architecture. And of course, many of you are familiar with the global platform that, just like the regional ones and the national ones, have a very official recognition by the UN General Assembly as important venues for learning, development, and influencing policy. So with this architecture and everything that is growing, affiliated and associated, like the Global Risk Forum, like all the parts that you are working with, is a really critical asset as we move forward. So whereas many things are happening, we understand better, we also feel the pressure, of course, of an increasing number of extreme events. I think I may have said before in one of the other meetings here in Davos, but the first time, at that time I worked with disaster response, but we did invite some climate specialists, I would say, and some Met Services people, and say, can you explain to us what climate change will do for us? And they said, well, we don't know very precisely, of course. This was about 10 years ago. Sometimes we get the same answer, but it's getting more and more precise. But they say, but plan for more extremes, more unpredictability, and more things that you never thought would happen to you happening. And if you just think back in the past 10 years, this is what's happening. You know, areas are drying, others have too much water, cyclones and storms happen in areas that are not familiar with them or have forgotten that they happened before. So under this pressure, you know, population concentration and a richer and richer world, the economic losses for disasters are increasing in leaps and bounds, and those that are experts in projecting this for the future project nothing but more growth of the economic losses. Mortality is, of course, a very critical measure for many good reasons of disasters. And in one way, the strong increase of early warning system has been successful, but only when it comes to hydrometeorological disasters. That's the only area where we have evidence, and in fact, only in one region in the world. In most other regions, the mortality, in fact, is increasing because of the concentration of population and because of the lack of preparedness and early warning system. So am I telling you that it doesn't work with the HFA? Of course it's working. You know, we have biannual report by governments measuring the impact of what they are doing. But many of them feel they are really only in the beginning of what they need to do. So when we move into the future, and since we are talking here to a science and technology community, one of the things we didn't have enough of, I should say, in the past decade is a very strong role of the science and technology community focusing on how disaster risks are developing. I think they were looking at climate change, or you were looking at climate change and other things, rapidly growing wealth, making full use of many competences. Now, at the same time, we are saying we need more knowledge. You know that knowledge risk assessment is really core elements of the HFA. So are we behind the curve a bit in the availability of knowledge? I would say yes. I don't think there is a shortage of knowledge, but I think it's poorly brought together and insufficiently easily made accessible and available to the users. So that's why in this past year or so, we have, thanks to many of you who are here today, we've really been moving to try to bring science and technology right back into the center of disaster risk reduction. Of course, more research, but also more engagement in the practices. When I listen to decision makers in different environments, very often there is an interesting little piece of research that looked into how do decision makers take decisions. Do they call on science to get the best advice? Who do they consider when they take decisions? Well, there's a rather discouraging answer, as you can imagine. Otherwise, I wouldn't give you the example. This report basically showed that under time pressure, under financial pressure, they would not use the best knowledge available. And this is, of course, disastrous. So the challenge really for us, for you and for all of us is how to get most of this scientific knowledge and technical knowledge right back into the center where decisions are made, and in a timely way. And most of all, I think, make it accessible, available, possible to understand. And what I, as a decision maker, would really like to know is, once I have the best knowledge on the table, is to understand the consequences of different courses of action that I may take. And I need help with that, because that's neither my expertise, nor do I necessarily have the capacity to do it. So also scientists right into implementation is something that we hope to see much more of. So all this has come out now. Since March 2012, we've been consulting. And what does it mean, consulting, where there has been local meetings, regional meetings, national meetings, global meetings, science meetings, etc. We really try to gather knowledge, ideas, inspirations from everywhere. And maybe importantly for where we go next, I think the messages have been very consistent. There has not been a huge difference between rich and poor countries. There has not been huge differences between different parts of the world. Really, the issues they have highlighted as their successes, but also as their challenges, have been quite similar. And some of the challenges are not really challenges that will make headlines. And I'm painfully aware of that if we propose to design a new framework around institutional redesign, and no one would be very interested, because this is, of course, not only an issue for disaster risk reduction, but it is a core issue to move forward with the risk management. that countries look at their institutions, and by all means in the international system, we also have some challenges in the same domain. So it's issues, who's involved, who takes responsibility, where does accountability lie, who assigns money and budget, who sets national priorities and strategies, and where does risk and risk reduction fit in that? Are there any Swedes here in the audience? Except for myself, a few down there, so please don't feel insulted by what I'm going to say now, because it's a very interesting case study of something that has happened in the last few months. Sweden had an absolutely unexpectedly large and serious forest fire in June. And I think the general impression by the Swedes was that they were not very well prepared for such a forest fire as they had. So once sort of this noise settled a little bit for that, what happened? Huge floods. Huge floods. And then I read a little interview with someone from this flooded community. She said, 4 years ago, we did a risk assessment in our community. And MSB, that's the Swedish National Disaster Expert Agency, they did the assessment with us. They gave us a list of recommendations. We needed 4 million Swedish krona. That's not a lot of money. And the local government didn't want to invest in it. So we didn't do anything. Had we done something then, the impact of these floods would not have been so severe as it is. And now here comes the most interesting point. One of the major political parties in Sweden wanted to decrease the budget with 10% for MSB. So this is a case study of how, and this is a country that doesn't think it's very disaster prone, but how different parts of what countries do actually don't fit together. So this whole issue of the institutional responsibility, the message that we have given, and many of you have given, I'm just passing it on, is the responsibility has to sit at the highest political level. Otherwise, you cannot really turn and change, and understanding how risk impacts every part of the community and society. So from that to the future then. The Third World Conference of Disaster Risk Reduction will happen in the middle of March next year in Japan. Japan will host this third conference as well. In fact, when I was in Japan earlier this year, one journalist, he asked me, why is Japan always hosting these conferences? Does it have to be Japan? I said, no, it doesn't have to be Japan, but Japan is always quick to say, when something terrible has happened, like the Great Eastern Japan earthquake, that they want to share what they have learned. So Japan very quickly, after the 2011 earthquake, invited the world community again. So now I don't think we should always link a world conference to a very big disaster, but I do hope, and this is a message to all of you, that one day we will see that the world conference takes place in another country in the world. So it's not only Japan that feels that this is a critical issue for them. So on the basis of the consultations, the UN General Assembly, now this is not a global platform that we are gathering in Sendai, it's an official UN conference, so it will look and feel different. But the preparation for the conference has been truly stakeholder, and what we now are putting forward to the World Conference is the aim is, of course, of the co-chairs that we will have a full agreement on the draft for the post-2015 disaster risk reduction agreement, so that when we get to Sendai, we can talk about the future. We don't negotiate the paper is agreed, everyone talks about now how do we implement, commit to plan of action, commit to participating, contributing and supporting, so that we together move immediately from this is the future to action. So formally the conference will, and I'm quoting the UN resolution, it will complete the assessment and the review of HFA. So we will look back a little bit at successes and challenges. And it will look particularly at national and regional experiences. So it will look at collaboration, it will look at, I mentioned the information flow, the institutional issues on the financing issues, both at regional and national level, and at local level, of course, and to review the recommendations that has been done. And then the conference will decide on what the General Assembly wished to have, namely a concise, focused, forward-looking and action-oriented post-2015 framework. Concise, focused, forward-looking and action-oriented. Now, not many UN documents are short or concise, as you know, and not always setting priorities. I think we have an opportunity to achieve concise, focused, forward-looking and action-oriented. I think the pre-zero draft is 12 pages. We said, let's try to propose something which is 7 pages, but of course in the process it became 12, and before we finish it will be a bit longer, I'm sure. But we're trying to stick to this concise and action-oriented in order to continue, which was really the value of HFA, because when I listen to what countries and organizations say, I really think that the only thing they have read in the HFA is the priorities for action. And that's good. So we should take that learning and say, it's the priority, people want to know what to do, and then they will do it. And this, on the other hand, is the most challenging thing when we now move forward, because what I realized is that there's a very, very strong attachment to HFA. When this whole conversation started, everyone wanted to see the future. We need to include new risk. We need to include what we have learned. But as we moved along, I realized that many countries, they really don't want to have a lot of change. Why? Because they quite recently started down the path of the action. And they say, don't move the goalpost all the time. Don't come with new frameworks that change everything. Then we don't feel we make progress. So the co-chairs that are leading this process now, because this is not UNISDR now, this is a process led by the co-chairs from Finland and Thailand and the Bureau of the conference, they are very sensitive to this. So they keep reminding us all the time that you have to make sure that you build on HFA and you don't abandon things that people feel they are still working on, and make it fairly similar. So for those of you who are looking for something dramatically new, you may not see the dramatically new immediately, but I hope you will see that there are the contents has moved forward. So what is the pre-zero draft? The pre-zero draft is now owned by the co-chair. It is their document, and they have presented it for the future. And what the pre-zero draft sets up is 3 revised strategic goals. The first one is on the prevention of creating new risk. And this is really essentially the development models of countries. So that corresponds essentially to the outcome of the discussion on the Sustainable Development Goal. But there are dramatic choices to be made. And this was the biggest gap in the HFA, the most difficult thing, the one that we feel very little progress has been done, even though progress has been done, I must say. The second strategic goal is to continue reducing the existing and the risks we do understand, of course. And the third one is about more social issues. It strengthens the resilience of communities through actionable social, economic, and environmental measures. And as you realize, these are also cutting across each other. There are some strong guiding principles. Yokohama had a lot of principles. HFA was not very strong on principles, but had quite a lot of things that needs to be protected. So guiding principles, the all of society approach must be inclusive, must engage institutions, and this is not an issue for disaster management authorities. In that case, it doesn't work. So holistic, include other sectors, private sector, business, not least. The strengthening, a lot of value attached to cooperation, both nationally but also globally. Protection of persons, respecting their human rights. The whole issue of governance, I already mentioned, how to govern risk at all levels, including global. Accountability strong, public-private partnership strong, and a continuous request and engagement by all parts of society. So how to ensure that we keep working the way we've done up till now is really, I think, a key area of development here. So the priorities of action are now, for the moment, I say in the pre-zero draft, 4 areas. The first one is understanding disaster risk, what I just talked about. It's strengthening risk governance for management of risk. It's preparedness for response, recovery, and reconstruction. Strong call for we must continue to strengthen our ability to be prepared, an early warning system. And there is a bit of a totally under-researched and under-collaborated area on how to make reconstruction, not really go back to zero all the time and try different models, but build on really good acquired knowledge. And finally, the investing in social and environmental resilience issues. So these are some of the main areas in the pre-zero draft. There is also in the pre-zero draft a strong call for science. ISDR had a science committee already more than 20 years, since 1989 it was established. So what the pre-zero drafts call for, it's a revitalization of that science mechanism. And with that revitalization, we have some pretty important ideas. But that revitalization would mean that the input of science and technology to help us to monitor and understand the evolution of risk and to help to strengthen the evidence base for decision making and to help to bring different pieces of big global issues together more practically. I mean, we know, you know, that climate and disaster risk go hand in hand, but at the global level, they are separated processes. So in practice, they are already being much better integrated at national level. So how can we support that to happen without getting involved in the politics? There are many good examples where it's happening, but I think also the expectation is on science to do that. As many of you know, the IPCC now says that managing climate change is managing risk. I think that's a message to all of us that we are now more or less in the same arena and we can lead the practice development there. So 2015 is a complicated year. You can on the one hand say that it's a conference-intensive year, but you can also say this is really an opportunity. It's really an opportunity to strengthen these linkages between things that are intimately linked, of course, development, climate risk, and disasters. It's only at the global stage where they have become so separated in different political processes. But countries cannot really manage this unless we help to bring it together, and we all have responsibilities in breaking down that barrier. The other thing about 2015 is the change of the development framework to one that is universal. And of course, we have the same thing in the disaster risk reduction agenda, that over these past 10 years, when I first got acquainted with this issue, rich countries basically came to the conferences believing that disasters is a problem for poor countries. I don't need to say that that has changed very drastically. We are in a completely different conversation. And sometimes I think it's the richer countries in the world that are really driving the agenda because of the financial and economic and political understanding of where disasters can take us. So that universality is a very critical element. So 2015 is a great opportunity. We must use it well. And it will also help us to avoid a risk that is becoming very obvious, and that's what someone else, not me, called the policy-induced risks. I think this is a very insightful and very concrete description of what happens when you are not linking up different parts, when you are not linking environmental planning with disaster risk planning or climate risk planning, climate adaptation planning, infrastructure, education, then you create new risks, and we can see that all the time. So what will happen from now until March? On the 5th of September, member states in Geneva start, it's called informal open-ended consultations on the pre-zero draft. And these consultations will go on from the 5th of September to middle of October. So there will not be any new draft done. They will talk, discuss, present ideas, opinions. The co-chairs will receive all this. There are 3 sessions, specifically 3 days, specifically designed for major groups, for non-government system, including science and NGOs, all the major groups in the UN system. And in the middle of October, the co-chairs will close that round of consultation, and they will come up with a new draft. That new draft will be this zero draft that will go to the second Prepcom, which takes place in the middle of November, the 17th and 18th of November in Geneva again. And the second Prepcom will be seriously negotiating on that text. Member states will negotiate, the rest of us can contribute ideas. So after the second Prepcom, there will be, of course, more discussions on the then zero draft or draft 1. And that will continue if we are going to be ready for the World Conference. We cannot go much beyond middle of February because it needs to be translated to all the UN languages. But if they are not fully ready, there is a chance to have a third Prepcom, a very short one, the day before the World Conference in Sendai. So Sendai will be essentially a very formal and official UN segment. It will be multi-stakeholder segments as well, and there will be a public forum, which Japan is particularly inviting to. So on the public forum, where you will be able to present a lot of what you may want to bring to a very large audience, just to be very practical, there's a very short deadline to register your wish to be part of the public forum. In fact, officially the deadline is the 16th of September. So if you aspire to be part of that, please go into our website and try to register. We may be able to extend it a bit, but for the time being, it's a short deadline. For all the other events, we will invite people to come as speakers, because there are not so many events possible as in a normal global platform. So there will be plenary sessions, ministerial roundtables, some heads of states, and then there will be senior technical level sessions, all focusing on the future. And the final thing that is expected there is what we call commitments, voluntary commitments, we call them. But in fact, one of the members of the Bureau said, why should they be voluntary? If they are voluntary, I cannot trust that people do what they promise to do. So maybe they should be commitments with some hard evidence behind that the commitments will be delivered. And this will become an official and part of the official outcome of the conference. So the final thing that I want to highlight here is that we are now working on a revised and updated monitoring system, an outcome-oriented system, not an input-oriented one. So just like in all the other global processes, there is an intense engagement in indicators and targets right now. And these will be helped, of course, with there's a background paper if you are interested in this, and my colleague Kazuko, who is here somewhere, she will stay with you the next few days, and you will get a chance to hear more about the new monitoring system, which is a proposal. It will be, of course, decided by member states and experts if this is what they would like to have. And we're also trying to make sure that that has a strong fit with the other monitoring system of development and climate issues. So these are some of the key issues. There is a lot more going on than what I can share with you now. But the key point is that there is something that is important for all of you there. So I hope if you're not already involved in giving feedback on the pre-zero draft, engaging with the major groups, or if you are governments, talk to your governments. Because this is the opportunity really to design how we manage risk in the coming decades. And I'm saying decades because clearly there is no hunger to revise the future HFA every 10 years. It's too frequent. So instead we'll have to look at a gradual evolution. So in the whole arena of the many partnerships that has been built around disaster risk, many of you, and we've heard from the colleagues earlier here, many things that are happening. But particularly important has been in this past decade also the engagement in the private sector and business, and many parts of business. 10 years ago, we only talked about the insurance industry. Today, we talk about the financial industry, about infrastructure, we talk about many different areas, communications. But today, and since Walter has already highlighted that the risk award will come next, I would like to introduce as one of the partnerships that has grown out of this understanding of risk over the past decade. This is a joint effort between the GRF, between you and ISDR, and the Munich Re Foundation, is the risk award, which is given out now. This is the third time it's given out. So I will invite Thomas Loster, through the chairman, to join us here on the stage and to introduce this year's winner and the many good applications that we have for it, so that you will all be able to take part of that very interesting outcome. But I thank all of you for your engagement, and I hope to hear and see a lot of you in the next 7 months leading to Sendai, and afterwards, of course. That's when we will really count on who is in and who is really staying with us. So, best wishes for your conference in the next few days, and I look forward to the outcome of the conference. Thank you.